Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Leakey, and today I want to talk about the Holy Saints John, and more to the point, where do we get these ideas from, and what do they really mean? We've dug into the Holy Saints John to some degree, but I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive today. So today we are embarking on a fascinating journey to explore the profound significance of the Holy Saints John within the rich tapestry of Masonic teaching. Their presence in our lodges, rituals, and symbolism is not merely a historical quirk, but a deep well of wisdom that continues to guide Masons in their daily lives. We'll trace their story from their early appearance in medieval art and thought, through the Northern Renaissance, and ultimately to their pivotal role in Freemasonry, examining deeper interpretations and enduring lessons that they teach us for modern society. So let's start at the beginning. When we start this story, we need to start at the end of the Roman Empire, 476. And we're entering into the Middle Ages, the medieval, the Dark Ages, however you want to term it. Typically, we say medieval in history today. And at the time, literacy rates are quite low, probably roughly 10% is a good estimate, and the vast majority of the people that are literate are monks. They are men of the cloth. Christianity, of course, has developed very quickly, starting from the time of Jesus to Constantine around 300 AD. We see about 1 to 3% of the population is Christian. From 300 to 600, right in the time frame that we're starting, Christianity goes from 1 to 3% of the population to about 95% of the population in Europe is practicing some form of Christianity, some form of Catholicism, really, or what is today Catholicism. So we have illiterate people familiar with Catholicism, which means they're going to use religious symbols from Christianity to get across many ideas. And these are going to take on visual terms. So we see the Holy Saints John in art quite a bit. Because again, if you can't read, the Bible isn't going to help you. Images will help you. And that's where we start. So the concept of the Holy Saints John appearing together, often on a single canvas, predates Freemasonry by centuries, with its roots firmly placed in the medieval, although it turns up quite a bit in the Renaissance as well. Again, during the Renaissance, literacy is climbing, but it still isn't there yet. This artistic juxtaposition wasn't accidental, it's deliberate. They're putting these two saints together for a reason. John the Baptist, the forerunner of Jesus, is often seen as the last prophet of the Old Testament. He has a life of asceticism. In other words, he is avoiding temptation. He's trying to avoid the pleasures of life. His fiery sermons in the wilderness and his call for repentance represent a connection to the origin of all life, a raw and direct engagement with divine will. In contrast, John the Evangelist, the beloved disciple and author of the fourth gospel in the book of Revelation, represents the New Testament. He embodies a more contemplative, intellectual approach, looking towards the end of the world and deeper spiritual truths. Artistically, these are put together because they are ends of a spectrum. They give us a sense of the human condition and the boundaries within which it exists. The heavily aged, bearded Baptist, his body marked by austerity, was often juxtaposed with the youthful, serene evangelist, often depicted with moving, flowing robes, the robes giving a sense of passion or religious energy. The inclusion of animals, a lamb with the Baptist and an eagle with the evangelist, further reinforces this symbolic effect. The Baptist, again, tends to be associated with Jesus and the starting of his ministry, and so we see a lamb. The eagle with the evangelist, because he can see everything. He sees revelation, he sees the life of Jesus, all of these ideas. These figures, though distinct, share a fundamental connection. Both encountered Jesus in their lives, serving as a powerful guide and serving as witnesses to his life. Now, usually in this presentation, I go into the art and I talk about Van Eyck and the Ghent altarpiece, etc. We're going to skip over that because podcasting doesn't allow for images. So we're not going to worry about that. And we're going to move into Masonic symbolism. So how do these two prominent Christian saints that we see throughout medieval and Renaissance art, often placed together, often with the Virgin Mary, the image of Jesus, sometimes at crucifixions elsewhere, how do they become so central to a fraternity like Freemasonry? The precise historical reason remains somewhat shrouded in mystery, a very common theme we see in Masonry. One theory suggests a connection to medieval guilds, which often adopted patron saints for protection and guidance. While Freemasonry is not a religious organization, it likely inherited traditions from these from these operative forebears. They're also, as they're setting up the language and the symbolic language of Masonry, all those symbols and ideas that we teach, they're going to be using things that people are going to be familiar with. And that's going to include these images of the Holy Sis John, which had been part of Catholic tradition for hundreds of years at this point. These images appear in windows, they appear in illuminated Bibles, illustrated Bibles, they appear all over the place. We also see in some of the stonemasons guilds, including one in Germany as early as 1440, referring to themselves as the Brethren dedicated to St. John. A more direct link in the practice of early Masons taking their obligation on the Bible, specifically open to the first chapter of the Gospel of John. The opening verse of John, quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," held particular significance. The Masonic word, a secret granting access to Masonic privileges, was symbolically intertwined with the Word in the Gospel. This connection was so strong that Masons in the 17th and 18th centuries, the 16 and 1700s, were sometimes referred to as St. John's Masons. While the evangelists seem to have been the initial focus, the Baptist Association likely followed, completing the symbolic pair, and it doesn't necessarily follow that's just where we first find this evidence. We find the evangelist, then we find the Baptist. However, that doesn't mean that that's what was going on. It simply means we haven't found evidence for focus on the Baptist quite as early. Their feast days, June 24th for St. John the Baptist and December 27th for St. John the Evangelist, loosely coincide with the summer and winter solstices. This alignment further underscored their symbolic duality, connecting them to cycles of light and dark, growth and reflection. When we look at the Holy Sis John, the fact that they represent winter and summer, light and dark, again gets at that spectrum, that idea that they provide bounds that we should not pass. This is starting to sound pretty familiar. And these are ideas, the feast days, for example, exist well before Masonry. And so this is going to be common knowledge, common practice in Catholicism, in Christianity. Really, we're before the Reformation at this point. So Christianity. But the symbolism would be well known. It makes it a great universal symbol that can be brought into Masonry and everyone will understand it. Also, St. John the Evangelist feast day on December 27th is the only one in Masonic code, at least in the jurisdiction of Wisconsin, because you must install officers within a certain number of days of the feast day of St. John the Evangelist. That bit of trivia aside, let's move on to some interpretations. First, we have the idea of zeal versus intellect. In Freemasonry, the Holy Saints John are not simply historical figures. They're potent symbols representing fundamental principles. One of the most common and profound interpretations sees them as personifying two essential yet contrasting human qualities, those of zeal and intellect. John the Baptist represents zeal, action, passion, the active pursuit of truth. He was a man of the wilderness, a voice crying out, urging immediate repentance and preparation. His message was direct, uncompromising, and called for swift action. In a Masonic context, the Baptist inspires us to be fervent in our pursuit of knowledge, diligent in our work, and courageous in upholding our principles. He represents the necessary passion to initiate change and to stand firm in one's own convictions. John the Evangelist, on the other hand, represents intellect, contemplation, wisdom, and the reflective understanding of truth. He was the beloved disciple known for his deep theological insights and his profound writings. The evangelist encourages us to delve deeper, to reflect on our experiences, to seek inner light, and to gain understanding through study and meditation. He reminds us that passion alone is insufficient. It must be tempered by wisdom and knowledge to lead to genuine enlightenment. Together, they teach us the importance of balancing these two forces within ourselves. A Mason must possess the zeal to act righteously, but also the intellect to understand the implications of those actions. Without zeal, knowledge is inert. There's no reason for us to pursue it. Without intellect, passion is oftentimes misguided. So we need both of them. Again, creating boundaries which we should not pass. Then we get into the issue of the interpretation, focusing on them as representations of the Old and New Covenants. Another powerful interpretation connects the Saint John to the New and Old Covenants, or more broadly, the progression of spiritual understanding in Christianity. John the Baptist, as the last prophet of the Old Testament, bridges the gap between the Old Law and this new law, new dispensation, the spiritual church rather than the ritualistic church. He embodies the preparation, the foundation, the ethical code that must be laid before true spiritual illumination can occur. He represents the necessary purification, the adherence to foundational principles. Masonically, he represents the working tools. He represents the basic lessons given during the first couple of degrees. John the Evangelist, as a representative of the New Testament, signifies the fulfillment of prophecy, the advent of a deeper spiritual understanding, and the transformative power of divine love. He speaks to a more evolved state of consciousness, moving beyond strict adherence to law towards a more profound, internalized spirituality. Really, we reach John the Evangelist at the end of the staircase, when we're looking at astronomy, when we're looking at the letter G. These ideas give us sort of those two phases of Masonry, the physical preparation in the material world and the spiritual preparation that we take internally. In a Masonic sense, this is the journey of the initiate. We begin by learning fundamental moral lessons, the Old Testament, preparing our hearts and our minds. As we progress, we are introduced to deeper philosophical and spiritual truths, the New Covenant, moving towards a more enlightened understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe. This progression is not about abandoning the old, but about building upon it, just as the New Testament builds upon the old. Then we move into a third interpretation, the point within a circle, or circumpunct, which I've talked about on this podcast before. The symbolism of the Holy Saints John is most explicitly and powerfully illustrated in one of Freemasonry's most fundamental symbols, the point within a circle, bordered by two perpendicular parallel lines, surmounted by the volume of sacred law. This is the circumpunct. The point represents the individual Mason, is the center of his being, his consciousness, his unique journey. The circle represents the boundary line of a Mason's duty to God, to all of mankind, but especially to his brethren. And it signifies the limits within which a Mason should circumscribe his passions and actions, there are those terms coming up again, ensuring that they do not overstep the bounds of morality and rectitude. The two perpendicular lines, as you're familiar, represent the Holy Saints John. John the Baptist on one side, John the Evangelist on the other. And they stand as moral compasses guiding the individual Mason between zeal and intellect, between darkness and light, keeping us in that middle path, in that middle way where we can truly act prudently and with temperance. The volume of sacred law placed atop the circle is the source of morality and spiritual light. It reminds the Mason that his actions within the circle, guided by the Holy Saints John, must always be in accordance with the divine precepts found in his sacred text. In other words, you don't get to make up your own rules. You don't get to make up your own morality. You have to work with a larger moral code, a universal moral code, which is well in standing with, or well in alignment with Masonry, which sees itself as a potential universal virtue, universal morality, or at least that's what we teach. The ritual teaches us that in going around this circle, we necessarily touch upon these two parallel lines. And this beautifully illustrates the Masonic ideal. By keeping himself circumscribed within the precepts of the volume of sacred law and guided by the balanced principles embodied by the Saints John, zeal and intellect, action and contemplation, it is impossible for a Mason to materially err. The Saints John act as two extremes that define the moral universe within which the Mason must find his balance, with the volume of sacred law as his ultimate guide. They are also two extreme ends of a spectrum, as I've talked about. The enduring power of the Holy Saints John in Masonic teaching lies precisely in their representation as two extremes of a spectrum. They're not meant to be chosen between, but rather to be integrated and balanced, to live between. You're not choosing one of them, you're trying to choose to balance the two. And by the way, you're not always balancing them perfectly. We're not always that point right in the middle. Sometimes we may need more passion. Sometimes we may need more wisdom. And that's important. Sometimes we might need to be strict and rigorous. At other times, we may need to be compassionate. Again, playing between those extremes. John the Baptist depicts the extreme of rigor, austerity, directness, unyielding adherence to truth. He represents the necessity of discipline, the courage to speak truth to power, and the unwavering commitment to one's principles, even when it demands sacrifice. This can be seen as the active or fiery extreme. John the Evangelist depicts the extreme of love, contemplation, introspection, compassion, profound understanding. He represents the importance of compassion, the pursuit of wisdom through quiet reflection, and the transformative power of spiritual insight. This can be seen as the passive or watery extreme, though reflective is perhaps a better term. And we see this not only in the point within a circle, but we also see it, for example, in the 5 orders of architecture. The Tuscan, that simplest column, can represent John the Baptist, his austerity, his strictness, whereas the composite can represent the compassion, the beauty of St. John the Evangelist. And those 5 orders suddenly take on a whole different meaning because you're again trying to exist within a center point along a spectrum. A Mason's journey is about navigating between these two poles. It's about having the conviction of the Baptist without becoming dogmatic or unyielding, and embracing the wisdom of the Evangelist without becoming passive or detached. The space between them, circumscribed by the volume of sacred law, is where true Masonic character is forged, a life of moderation, balance, and centeredness. So what's the relevance today? This is all fantastic, but how am I going to use this when I'm deciding how to handle day-to-day situations? What is the lesson in today's complex world? Well, there are a few. First of all, the need for balance. In a society often driven to extremes, extreme viewpoints, extreme consumption, extreme reactions, the Saints John remind us of the virtue of moderation. We are constantly pulled between passion and reason, conviction and compromise, action and contemplation. Their symbolism encourages us to seek a harmonious middle ground where zeal is informed by wisdom and wisdom is energized by righteous passion. We need both. Going out and seeking knowledge isn't going to happen if you don't have a passion for it. And sometimes we can become overly passionate about something and alienate those around us. They also speak to integrity and moral courage. Both Johns were figures of immense integrity and moral courage. The Baptist stood against corruption, even at the cost of his life. The evangelist remained steadfast in his faith and teaching. In an age where integrity can seem elusive, they remind us to uphold our principles, even when it's difficult, and to speak truth with both conviction and compassion. They also speak to personal transformation. At their core, both Johns call for transformation, the Baptist through repentance and purification, the evangelist through deeper spiritual understanding. This resonates with the Masonic journey of self-improvement. They inspire us to constantly reflect on our actions, refine our character, and strive to become better versions of ourselves, contributing positively to our communities and to the world. And then they encourage us to move beyond dogma to principle. While rooted in Christian figures, the Masonic interpretation of the Saints John transcends sectarian dogma. They become universal forms of human endeavor, the doer and the thinker, the active and the contemplative. This allows their lessons to resonate with individuals of all faiths, focusing on the shared moral and ethical principles that unite humanity. At the end of the day, we need someone to go out and just do, and sometimes we need to stop and think and contemplate our actions. Sometimes we need someone to actively go out there, and sometimes we need that same person to contemplate. We need both. And sometimes when we strip away the symbolism, the Christianity, the religion from these symbols, from the Holy Saints John, we get to this very basic understanding. And that can be really helpful because now we're not worried about all of these specifics of the religion and we're looking only at the lesson. So the Holy Saints John, through their historical presence, artistic depictions, and especially their profound Masonic symbolism, offer a timeless blueprint for a well-lived life. They challenge us to embrace both the fiery zeal for justice and the calm wisdom of contemplation. They teach us that true progress lies not in choosing one extreme over another, but in harmonizing them, finding our point of balance within the circle of duty, guided always by the volume of sacred law. As Masons, we're called to embody this balance, to be men of action, reflection, zeal, and understanding. In doing so, we not only improve ourselves, but also contribute to building a better, more harmonious world, truly living up to the ideals of our ancient and honorable craft. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lickey, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.